We're going to keep the balls rolling at high speed. Stu and Dean, come and take your position.
This one?
I mentioned there that we want to talk about national security. You probably have fixed ideas about what national security is, particularly against the kinetic threats or the other threats militarily. But national security is now having a much broader definition, and one is needed. Let me introduce to you our two speakers. He's newly elevated to the House of Lords, Air Chief Marshal, the Lord Peach of Grantham. Stu Peach, welcome. Formerly Chief of Defence Staff of the United Kingdom, formerly Chairman of the Military Committee in NATO until last year, before that Head of Joint Forces Command, and also Chief of Defence Intelligence, and also Dean Rosenfield, who's from Australia, but Group Managing Director of Saab UK. And what we want to do in these 25 minutes is try and highlight for you just how profound the challenges are now on national security. Stu.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for this opportunity. And it's a great group, and it's a very good event. I think weaponization is my first thought, and I don't think Russia will stop, and I don't think China will stop finding new ways to use that word. Energy is on our minds, and it's been well covered. But actually, we should have prepared better. And where was the proper surveillance system to protect our pipelines? Food weaponization is real, and it again is part of Russia's playbook. And I would argue it's been part of Russia's playbook through the Soviet time and before. We can see the weaponization of migration, sensitive political issue in Sweden and in the UK and across Europe. But we can see it. People are not quite who they present themselves to be. And of course, as ever in military history, we can see winter ahead of us in the war in Ukraine. And I understand the great pitch from The Economist, strongly agree with it. We need to sustain our unity. And my theme in this session, Nick, is exactly that. How we do it, we take a broader definition of national security. You do it in Sweden through total defence. We can do it in the UK. We're already partners in the Joint Expeditionary Force. I'm not here to pitch for it, but it's a real thing. Let's stretch it. Let's imagine it as a digital thing. We can improve, and we must improve, both countries, our resilience. It's a word that I think matters. It takes many forms. It's about the political leadership, as we just heard. It's also about structures in society and willingness of people in society to do their bit. And we also need to understand the technology as an opportunity and as a risk. The other word I haven't heard this morning too much, Nick, is security in the sense of keeping our secrets safe and keeping what we need to keep secret secure. They are different. And so when I was delighted to see the reference to quantum-based cryptography, this is not just a buzzword. Putin will exploit weakness in the information space. Again, mis and disinformation are very real partners for Russia and China. And therefore, finding the truth in all that propaganda is not new in warfare, but it's very much alive and well in the 21st century. So what's the answer? Well, the solution we need to find is to work more closely together with industry, between strong partners such as UK and Sweden. In an alliance is better, within a group is good. But above all, we need to think carefully about not allowing our own boundaries, whether they're political, industrial, military, to become a problem that Russia, who is now off the fence as against our values and our way of life, and China, who is off the fence, despite the very telling statistics, in a way, I would say, with 50 years military experience, and I'll stop here, actually that peak China point makes China more unpredictable and more dangerous. And I strongly associate with your thoughts about how leadership will have to evolve, and the days of the autocrat may be numbered, but I will say to you, in a serious moment, that does not make them less dangerous as they face the exit.
Stu, just before we go to Dean, again, just broadening that point which we made at the beginning and continued during the last discussion about what really security is. It's not just defense against an adversary.
No, it's not. And then it is about not drawing new boundaries and saying, well, you can do energy, but only a bit. So everybody has to play their role. Where is the new ship that doesn't run on as much diesel? Where are the aircraft technologies that allow electric powered flight? Maybe the military should lead on that rather than follow. Where are the ways in which we can use fewer people on the battlefield and put fewer people in danger? How do we advance military medicine? One of the great unsung things about war is war is a terrible tragedy for humans, but it's a spur on medicine. And so where are these ideas that the Ukraine conflict can generate as opportunities?
How do you see it from the Saab point of view, Dean? New opportunities, obviously, there's a need for what you produce. How have you had to respond, given that these are all national decisions involving procurement, spending large amounts of money, and getting it the day after tomorrow?
I think a lot of it comes down to actually cooperation and planning. So at the end of the day, and I think Stuart talked about it in terms of resilience. If I go back to resilience in supply chains, we saw that obviously during the pandemic, the global supply chains and globalisation had actually retracted. So we retracted to almost a deglobalised position whereby everyone was looking very much nationalistic. If you look at it from a defence industry perspective, we were then looking at what does our global supply chain actually mean now, and where is that global, or where is that supply chain?
Is it vulnerable?
It was vulnerable, and it's vulnerable because of through the pandemic. Without a cooperation, without understanding where the threats are coming from, it makes it very difficult to then predict and provide that security or predictability to small to medium enterprises. They don't know, they're turning in their supply chains, or we're turning their supply chains on, and all of a sudden we turn them off. Every time we turn them back on again, it takes time to ramp up, and that ramp up time obviously costs defence because we're not getting the capability in their hands quick enough.
What about the ability to have enough in stock? I mean, we have to now look, both of you, at a very bleak scenario, potentially if Putin decides to go all the way in many ways. Do you believe that the system, which a year ago was not fully supplied with procurement, now is adequately supplied, or there's going to be a massive rush through companies like yours to provide the stocks that are needed?
I think it's widely publicly known now as well that if you look at the stocks are depleted, and stocks have been given in terms of what they've been using. That's certainly depleting many nations' stocks. At the same time, those nations, since the end of February, have actually been reaching out to defence industry. We've been reaching out to our supply chains. We've been looking at alternates, and we have actually taken on risk within the industry and within various governments as well, and have started preparing. So if you'd have asked me that question in May, June, I would have said we would have been in very much a dire situation. But I think now with the preparedness, with the resilience, thinking again, not nationalistically, but globally, and definitely from a regional supply chain perspective, I think we're ramping up very rapidly.
Now, both of you, the UK has an integrated review which was published, a couple of years ago, and Stu, you'll have been involved in this. But how much does that have to be redefined? In other words, it was wrong. It was it pulled its punches about the threats coming down the track.
I don't think it was wrong. I think a lot of things have come into sharp focus, as again this morning is made clear. And so it needs to be refreshed, which is happening right now. We need to work with our partners, Sweden.
Do you believe that it'll be dramatic enough, given what
I don't think very few things I've seen in my military career have been dramatic enough for my personal taste, but it'll be a step in the right direction. What I would say in answer to both questions, Nick, is we really have to, we use a word in the military, it's not jargon, it's a real word, called interoperability. And I'm always disappointed when I see very similar weapon platforms or very similar weapon types that can't use each other's ammunition, can't share, can't even talk to each other. So when we talk about crypto-based, quantum-ready security, we need to make sure that that is available to partners and allies. We need to make sure the missile stocks, when built up again, can be used on different platforms. We need to make sure that we can genuinely operate together, not with everybody in the globe, but with the like-minded people we're likely to work with. And that is a good way of both bringing down the cost and sharing the burden. And that's what interoperability really means. And then last but not least, we need and going back to the thoughts about leadership, we also need interoperability of command and control. Because one of the things the Russians have shown us this year is actually when you get command and control wrong, things go wrong really, really fast. And so getting command and control right, which is something UK and Sweden should be good at, really does make a difference.
What I'm trying to nail down, and Dean, can you come in here, is what is the realistic assessment now that has to be made about the new security order? In other words, how countries have to prepare themselves, both politically and also financially, for the enormity. In other words, picking up on what Jan Olsen was asking about using negative and positive, I was sort of saying, what isn't the word realistic? How realistic do we now need to think about the enormity of what may now be threatening?
I think it comes down to understanding why you have a defence force in the first place and why you need to equip it. And it's obviously, I think there's been a huge wake-up call for many nations around the fact that having that defence capability and having that equipment, the solutions in place, it deters conflict. And at best, it helps you defend against aggression. So I think we've learned a lot from a nationalistic perspective. But again, as Stuart said, it comes down to those alliances and the cooperation. Not every nation needs to do the same thing. If we actually start to look at alliances, we can actually balance that within a region or within an alliance. And that's one of the beauties that I think with Sweden joining NATO is that we will get, yes, we've always made interoperable solutions and capabilities, Gripen in Czech and Hungary, etc. But we'll now get into some sensitive technology areas, and in particular, the command and control. So we'll be even tighter cooperation. So that's, I think, a big drive for many nations is actually understanding what is sovereign to them, what do they really need, and how do we actually cooperate and share within that within an alliance.
Same question to you, Stu. How bleak should a realistic assessment now be?
The assessment is bleak, but it's not all gloom and doom. Because, for example, the UK and Sweden trust each other. We may not be in a formal alliance, but we're in an informal relationship. We have a great friendship between the militaries. It's more than friendship, and it applies to some of the systems we need to share for the future. We could stretch that. We could do more. We could do that with the region. In the north of Europe, there's an alignment. It's not just the jokes and the beer and the football. It's more than that. And so I do really believe in this, and I speak as a former military head of NATO. Actually, the alliance, everybody talks about the politics. Everybody talks about the meetings. And one of my best boss, if not my best boss ever, was also called Jens. And I think Mr. Stoltenberg has done a brilliant job as the Secretary General. But NATO is more than that. 30 nations. Command and control in peacetime, which is permanent and works. Secure networks. Surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance. It is a thing, it's an organism. It grows, and it's grown to 30 nations. It has all these things to enable it. And of course, NATO can help with interoperability. NATO can help with procurement. And so as we look forward, we need to slightly step away from the political doom and gloom and look at what works. Which I think came out of the previous session. And it's just the same in the militaries. A lot of things work, even if they're not in the headlines.
Anyone want to come in, please? Particularly if you're uncomfortable about the way, right at the back. I'll come to you in a moment. How do you prepare yourself, Dean? There are obviously confidential and security issues you can't talk about, but how does an enormous company like yours prepare itself to supply what could be needed, which is quite remarkable. You know, we're 60 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we almost went to war, or the Americans almost went to war, the Soviets almost went to war with the Americans. These are not unthinkable times anymore. These are unpalatable times.
The best way to prepare is through collaboration. It's actually, from an industry perspective, working with governments, understanding where the threat is, where the government wants to go, what it wants to defend, how it wants to defend, and what its requirement is on industry. And then we collaborate.
Do you get clarity from governments?
Well, we certainly are at the moment. We have a very, very close dialogue. I think there's a realisation now that industry is a fundamental input to capability. So even the service chiefs now need to understand what industry can do to support and sustain them on operations.
All right, please.
Daniel Franklin from The Economist. Question really for Lord Peach. You talked about weaponisation, and it was mainly defensive weaponisation that, in fact, sorry, I'll stand up. defensive weaponization, things that Russia and others are using against us in the West, energy, food, and so on. But is there a sort of reverse weaponization that we should be using against hostile powers? And I don't mean just providing weapons, which we're obviously doing, but are there areas such as information where they are weak and we potentially are not using our potential to the extent that we could, and the truth is arguably their greatest weakness?
Thanks, Daniel. Sorry, I couldn't see you in the shadows there. But just to underline that point about weaponization of things which were never seen as assets of security, and the way the Russians and the Chinese are now targeting. You talked about this when you were Chief of Defence Staff, and you talked about it publicly. You took a risk talking about it publicly, but no one really wanted to believe you.
Well, that was then, and I was a little bit surprised that there was no real discussion that followed. So I really appreciate this moment. Of course, in the military, you have to look at every setback as an opportunity. And you're absolutely right, and I've been talking about some of this for years. We have to protect our infrastructure better. And the UK and Sweden can do that in partnership with all our northern neighbours, because it's in our vital bilateral interest. And whether I'm talking about pipelines or cables or anything else. We can also re-attack the whole mis and disinformation. One of the least understood parts of NATO is NATO has 28 centres of excellence. Some of them are very tiny, but some of them do really good thinking about media landscapes, about information management. There's an outstanding centre of excellence, which is joint NATO-European Union in Helsinki, that looks at countering hybrid warfare. So you're absolutely right. We need to not necessarily advertise everything for obvious reasons. And we also need to understand economic consequences of the weaponization against us and look at ways of reversing that. And I go back to boundary in a sort of geopolitical sense, is of course, infrastructure takes a long time, doesn't it? I go backwards and forwards to the Balkans nearly every week on behalf of the British government. And I'm so struck, in answer to your question, is how far behind the whole of Southeast Europe is in infrastructure, and how we could leapfrog to a secure world where we're not absolutely dependent on Odessa, but there are other ways out of Western Ukraine, where we could have modern, efficient port facilities on the Adriatic, where there's virtually nothing. We could have thought about military mobility in a proper way, and again, the UK and Sweden could be thought leaders here, so that actually we can turn some of the ways in which Putin applies his logic on us against him. And it's as simple as that. But we have to therefore be ready to work together and invest together in some of the things we know we need to do to improve our resilience.
Dean, how much is there a dramatic change underway, what we've discovered from the way Russia does and does not use its assets? In other words, what are going to be the implications for Saab about selling aircraft, selling other things, which you probably can't talk about? But actually, there's a different kind of warfare which has emerged, which has surprised a lot of people.
I think there's been a lot of the use of commercial technologies. I mean, we've all seen the effects of the UAVs, but I think we don't need to react just yet in terms of change everything in regards to the way we set up the industry and where we're going in terms of how we deal with the threats. We've learnt in terms of that you need to adapt very quickly, but we don't want to have a pendulum which is swinging too far to the right, where we forget about our military equipment, our weapons, and start to look at everything from a commercial perspective. I think we've got to find that balance. Things are changing, technology is advancing very, very quickly, and from an industry perspective, we also need to advance very quickly as well, and I think we are.
Because there was a phrase which came out at the Aurora Forum last week about being able to buy weaponry on Amazon Prime, because actually it's off the peg, it's cheap, and it's just as effective.
Yeah, and what I think we were talking about there as well was about the acquisition model. It's very easy to go into Amazon, you know exactly what you want, you take it off the shelf and you take it as is. But in defence, when it comes to procurement, you're dealing with large sets of complexities in regards to legalisation, the terms and conditions, the IP protection, and you've got the actual process itself, which is typically a competition. But From an acquisition organisation, what governments need to do now is actually move a lot faster. So that is one thing we're actually learning. That is, if you've seen a technology or you've got a relationship with a particular provider, don't go out for competition just for competition's sake. Use the smart buyer approach, deal with that company and evolve that capability together.
But the issue of asymmetry, particularly, in other words, using technology which has not been assumed to be so effective as it's proven to be in Ukraine.
I think that really comes down to, again, sitting back, watching, taking those lessons learned, but in a cooperative fashion between government and industry. What have we learned from this and how quickly can we adapt?
Stu?
Some of that is also about the way in which you think about warfare through your doctrine, the way in which you organise through command and control, and then you apply that on the battlefield, none of which has been particularly good from a Russian perspective. From a Ukrainian perspective, first they understand how the Russians think, and they understand how the Russians operate, and that gives them a local tactical advantage. Secondly, they've empowered people on the battlefield. And there's a really important lesson for Sweden, the UK, and others in NATO here. And that empowerment, almost like a digital Uber at the front line, enables you to become more efficient. And then turning it around, going back to the previous question, one of the other things you can use is technology in ways to our advantage. On exercise Trident Juncture, in real world, over 3 years ago in Norway, we 3D printed a gearbox for a US tank. And with special permission, we put it into the tank, and the tank ran around on the exercise for 4 weeks without a single problem. I don't think that could happen in Russia. Now, the point I'm making is you then have to have, and it's really boring for great leaders such as you, but you then have to have the regulatory frameworks, not just the IP, which enable that sort of that added value, that advantage to happen. And that requires friendship and working together and getting used to each other, to trust each other.
Dean, can your products be 3D printed on the battlefield?
Parts of them can, yes.
Not the whole thing?
Not the whole thing.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not exactly, not yet. But we are printing, for example, parts of a Gripen aircraft, and we've demonstrated that as well.
Anyone want to come in, please? Microphone. Anyone else? We've got 4 minutes to run. Please go.
Question. If you compare the registration of patents and also utility models of China, Russia, and the West, what would happen? I know that the Chinese are astronomically fast and have an enormous amount of new ideas and patents. How would you respect that in a war situation if that gearbox was Chinese?
Well, it comes down to your supply chains, which is I can rightly say that a lot of the selection of our subcontractors and our suppliers, we ensure we don't use Russian and Chinese suppliers where we can. So it's actually making sure that we understand, and this comes down to responsible sales. And in that, you're actually understanding everything in your supply chain, how your subcontractors are conducting their business, what they're using to develop their products, how they're developing their products, before you make the choice of actually acquiring their technologies to put into your capabilities.
I may be brutally quick for this audience, and I apologize if you think I'm being too brutal, but we've known for years, if not decades, at boards, in companies, that we need to be more cyber secure. We now know we need to be more quantum secure. We've lost so much added value to China through theft, through IP theft. And we really need to stop it, because then precisely the scenario that we fear could be reversed upon us. But one ray of hope, the Chinese military is also modernizing at pace, and it has no relevant operational experience. Whereas in the West, we have that experience. And just to turn it round, a couple of times this morning was mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Russian equivalent, the CSTO. These are not the same as the NATO and the EU. They're not the same. And NATO and EU in cooperation, not in competition, is a powerful beast. And NATO, when it's on full song, when it's on the battlefield with 30 nations working in harmony, is a very powerful alliance. Russia has a ragbag of friends, and those friends, if you look at the detail, are getting fewer and far between.
One final thought, promoted by what Tom said earlier. can we imagine a conflict between Greece and Turkey over the Eastern Mediterranean? Is that an out-of-thinking possibility that we have to take really seriously? Two NATO nations going into conflict?
I think the risk of a misunderstanding is real. Therefore, there are lots of, hopefully, processes in place to resolve those issues. Secondly, if you look back at the history of our alliance, which is now 73 years old, they have faced a lot of frictions between allies, whether it was 12, 16, all the way up to 30. And each one of those, the Suez crisis was a big one between the UK and US. But actually, it was managed in NATO effectively. And so I have great confidence, having been part of the alliance for most of my military career, I have great confidence that NATO can manage these problems. But I also would urge everyone to talk not about potential conflict, but about potential peace, which is what most generals do in their spare time.
Dean and Stu, thank you very much indeed for helping define what the new security order is. Both of you, thank you enormously.
Thank you.